everything about it is there to see now. It's just a fantastic piece of property.
Everyone feels, my gosh, this is it. This is worth preserving. This is something that we want to keep.
The minute I saw this town and this area, I knew this was my place and where I wanted to raise my children and live for the rest of my life.
Whidbey Island is a long, glacier-carved ridge of land in Puget Sound, Washington State's inland waterway. Ponderous ferry boats and a bridge now bring commuters and vacationers to this beautiful setting away from the mainland cities. When early pioneers were searching for homes, the waters of Puget Sound were thoroughfares. Coupville, on the main northerly route, was one of the first settlements on the Sound. Until the new railroad towns on the mainland drew away shipping, Penn Cove, with its deep harbor backed by fertile prairies, attracted farmers, sea captains, and dreamers.
He come up to Ebey, he and his old Civil War veteran father, and he was going to go to work in a mill that made blocks to pave the city streets with there. And the mill burned down that night. And they were downtown looking in the window, and he and his father, and they're looking at potatoes and wheat, and it said grown on Whidbey Island, and they were talking, and up stepped a man. He said, I'm the skipper of the Fairhaven, and we're going to leave for Whidbey Island at 3 o'clock. And if you want to get your stuff together and come down there, I'll take you over there, and I'll introduce you to some of those people on the dock when we get there. And this is how my father come to Whidbey Island, just purely by chance.
There is an Indian legend about a place where the land and the sky and the water come together. They say at such a place you can slip through a crack in time. For a brief moment, you can see the past and the future. It could be that Ebey's Landing on Central Whidbey is such a place. The meeting of the land, the sky, and the water is magnificent, and the traces of the past are everywhere. Explorer George Vancouver described the land as a natural garden, just waiting for the English farmer to perfect it. The Indians thought it was perfect just the way it was.
The Indian people who lived here on Penn Cove 1,000 years ago probably had as high a population density in this area, or may have had as high a population density as the current population of this area. We're speaking about people who spent the winter in cedar plank longhouses, who had large cedar canoes, and practiced a wide variety of very sophisticated maritime activities, fishing in saltwater, taking seals and porpoises, other types of marine mammals.
The Indians who moved onto the land after the glaciers receded appreciated the protected cove and the rich prairie soil that had once been a glacial lake bed. For hundreds of years, they prevailed and flourished until the 1850s, when over a few short years, they found themselves losing the land of their heritage to new pioneers. The people who shaped the land we see now were not the Indians, but rather the American pioneers. Many of the present residents trace their heritage back to those first Whidbey settlers. Wilbur Sherman is one. He has farmed Ebey's Prairie for years, just as his father and grandfather did, and as Colonel Isaac Ebey did more than 100 years ago.
But what happened to the poor colonel was a year or so, or maybe during the year of 1857, the Haida Indians were down here, and they were troublemakers. They were the people that come down out of the Queen Charlotte's, and they were looking for slaves and just were mean Indians, according to the stories that I got from the Indians here. They were afraid of them. Well, so they got into trouble down Sound there, and one of our men of war was down there, and so they took it in hand to settle the thing with them, and they let a broadside go down through them in their canoes, and they killed a chief or two, and they killed several Indians. Well, right away, they had to have an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and they wanted to have an important white man, and they come up on the island here, and they wanted to know where high-ass Tyee was, you know. This Chinook language was about as crude as you could get it, but that's what he was looking for anyhow. So they told him about where Ebey was, that he was one of the important men, and so that night they come in off of the water. The dogs set up a howling around there, and Ebey went out to see what it was all about, and they shot him and cut his head off and disappeared in the fog in their canoes.
The Haida disappeared back to the Queen Charlotte Islands with Ebey's head. A Canadian trader who had been a friend of Ebey finally obtained the head and returned it to the family.
Finally, they got him put together, and he's here forever to stay.
A monument to the colonel and the early settlers now stands on a bluff overlooking Puget Sound. Isaac Ebey's house is gone, but his father's house still stands on a hill above what is now called Ebey's Prairie and Ebey's Landing. Ken and Claire Picard, who later led the fight to save Ebey's Prairie from development, lived for 10 years in the old Ebey house, a house that had been empty for 60 years.
There was sort of a mystery behind it. We were, in our generation, pioneering for modern times, but it wasn't real pioneering, and you were constantly reminded of that. We had to haul our water, and we had a windmill for electricity, and it was hard.
Many of the other pioneers found what they had followed the Oregon Trail for: good farmland, hard work, and a simple but comfortable life.
We had to work. There wasn't any escape from that, but that is one of the treasures I claim in my life. This prairie has changed from a wheat and potato thing until today. Most of what is raised here in the forage crops are all put through the cattle.
Let's go! Come on!
And practically all of the produce that comes off this prairie is shipped out in milk. The Chinese come in here, I suppose they must have come in the 70s somewhere, because I think old Jim Hill brought those people in here to build railroad, and then some of them would slip away, and they come over on the island, and they couldn't own land, and they couldn't bring women. So this is the reason they died out of here. When I was young, they were old, and soon they were all gone.
Around Penn's Cove, the town of Coupville grew, a town of sea captains who, like the Indians, appreciated the protected waters. The sea captains brought new people to the island and carried out the local crops as long as the island was on the main waterway.
Some were in the China trade, some were in the coastal trade. They were taking the timbers down to San Francisco for piles. in the docks and to Mexico for use in the mines. They settled down and it became known as the home of sea captains, and they lived and died there, contented, I'm sure.
Many of the finest homes were built by Howard Lovejoy, the son of one of the first sea captains.
And every house that you see in this community that he built, he put the best foundation that was available in those days. Now he built our Methodist church down there. That church is just as plumb and true today, I believe, as the day he built it. And so are the other buildings.
Coupville was kind of a little backwater. And I think that probably saved a lot of the old buildings, a lot of the historic buildings, and it remained a small town with a small town atmosphere and a very friendly atmosphere, and the people know each other. It's a rare individual that'll come into Coupville to live that doesn't get the feeling of the town and get the feeling that they want to be part of the town and that they want to help do the best for the town.
But in the late 1960s, as people moved out of the cities to country homes, the scenic property of Ebey's Prairie became more valuable as potential home sites than as farmland.
Probably in about 1969 or 70, there was a development proposal for the Smith Farm on Ebey's Prairie, which consisted of townhouses and a lot of residential lots, tennis courts, the whole 9 yards.
It wasn't just a visual encroachment as far as seeing the prairie, but it also was a threat to the other farmers, because it's pretty hard for city people, if they move into an area like that, to live next to we'll say a cow barn.
The development proposal would have put houses in the historic heart of the community.
In my youth, I played all over the prairie here, and in fact, that's when I met Karen. I think the first time I can remember meeting Karen was she was about 5 years old, and we were out roaming the prairie.
When we left here to go in the Peace Corps, there were earth movers up on the property up here that the farm didn't own yet, and we thought that we would be coming back to a housing development next door to the farm.
A small group of people began meeting in 1969 to try and find a way to preserve Ebey's Prairie. They and others, the Friends of Ebey as they became known, worked through the courts and their congressmen for 13 years to preserve this land.
I remember specifically what happened as far as my involvement. I was sitting in my office in Seattle at headquarters 13th Naval District, and I got a phone call from Joan, and she said they're going to do something. They're going to build on Ebey's Prairie, and it looks like, you know, all of that area out there is going to be lost, and as we know it today and as it was before. And she said, we have to do something. And so I said, okay, I'll be home just as soon as I can, and we'll talk about it.
It didn't seem the right thing to do, to build out there, because the first time I ever saw that place, or anyone ever sees it and goes out there, they know it's special and different and unique in all the world.
Basically, it was the fundamental private property rights issue, and at that time it was very unpopular to try to tell somebody what they could do with their land.
If someone's starting talking about preserving your property, what does that mean monetarily? And that's very, very valid.
Because we felt that if they were going to sell the property, then if it were sold to the government, if it were sold to a private developer, if it was sold to the state, it really wouldn't make much difference as long as they received the, you know, just compensation. And that's the point we approached it from.
We really went nowhere legally, other than just it gave us time to look for sources of funding and other ways to try to preserve the land.
And preserve the land they did. In 1978, after years of bitter dispute, Congress created the country's first reserve, Ebey's Landing National Historic Reserve. The local citizens and the National Park Service agreed on a plan to preserve not just the land, but the spirit of the past that came from years of people working the soil. The Park Service bought the development rights to the prairie, But the land and its future remained with the residents.
It's just fantastic when you think of Keystone and Fort Casey, Ebey's Prairie and Landing, Grasser's Bluff, Fort Ebey, Paragos Bluff. People can see this settlement that was actually completed in 1853. And you have to give the farmers credit because they understand whether it's heritage land, they understand that. I think they'll continue to farm and to keep it for the future and for their own children who will be farming too.
As far as our business goes, it's really nice that the land is having these easements because we want it to be agriculture. We want it to farm. I want to see this area stay farming forever. I don't want to see it destroyed.
I guess I have to come back to the word stewardship. That's really what it's all about. I think people owe an obligation to the future. If they have something of value, they should preserve it for the future. It's not just for your use or my use here and now, but for children, generations to come.
This is a good and stable community, and I think one of the reasons for that is because of the people that come were good people. They were God-fearing people, and they were brave people. People who would go across the country, and face Indian and famine, bad water, and every other old thing, and then come and be happy. This is the kind of stuff we're built out of.